Hello everyone, it's Ren here. Hope everyone is doing well. Welcome to my new room. I am now back to Ireland, and after a process of moving, I'm happy to say that I'm finally settled in my new house with two housemates, not the same housemates that I was living with before. One I was living with before, he's the NFP himself, a good friend, he's been a friend for a long time, and the other is, she tested INFJ the one time she took the test, so it will be interesting to see if if my experience confirms that. I think she's either INFJ or INFP. But let's, without further ado, go into a little discussion of types and styles of writing, or rather, I should say, communication in writing, because occasionally I get people asking me in the comments whether I'm able to recognize a type, a person's type, just by looking at the way they write, the way they communicate in writing. And whereas initially I was doubtful about the possibility of doing this, I have become, with experience and more exposure to people's styles, become more convinced that this is actually possible, and I frequently do it. Now, of course, it's easier to do when you have a whole book to read, and it's a novel, for example. It doesn't have necessarily to be a novel, but it could be a novel. In this case, I find that you can recognize function use if you pay close attention. If you read a novel, often you can recognize either whether the writer is using FI or FE and so on. But even in posts, even in messages that people write on YouTube, if a person is intuitive, I think intuition is key to recognize this, because it's hard to explain. But if you're strongly intuitive, you have a good knowledge of the MBTI personality system, and you read someone's way, you read someone's words, their way of communicating. I think that it's possible to say quite a few things. Of course, if there's only a couple of sentences, that's going to be harder than if there's a larger paragraph or a series of paragraphs, but you don't necessarily need a lot. So, I mean, here's a few pointers as to how I proceed. So the first thing that I want to say is, I don't have like a set of rules. In fact, I never intend to identify people's types, because, well, it's people's types are what they think they are, as far as I'm concerned. I just cannot help that sometimes I get certain impressions. I get certain impressions from the way people communicate, and it's based on these impressions that I then almost automatically figure out and think to myself, okay, this person seems to be kind of that type. And I don't do it consciously, or I don't do it deliberately. Sometimes I feel a bit bad about doing it because I don't want to pigeonhole people, like people put them in boxes. But this is nevertheless what happens, to some extent. So, first of all, if I'm going to focus on intuitive types probably in this video because I'm better at identifying them, quite simply. So sorry about the sensing types that are watching this video. I might not be talking about you very much, but first of all, I think there's quite a striking difference between someone who writes from an FE perspective or someone who writes from an FI perspective. Oftentimes, you will find that let me be even a little bit more specific here. We could distinguish between someone who's writing from an FETI perspective or a TIFE perspective, and somebody who's writing from an FIT perspective or a TEFI perspective. And to me, intuitively, the quickest way to separate the two is that when you're reading the words of someone who's writing from an FETI perspective, or the reverse, TIFE, you get the sense that they are implicitly reaching out to engage in an exchange. So there is this implicit desire that you feel for feedback, for opening up, for opening up the forum of exchange. Sometimes it will not be said explicitly, but you get this feeling that the desire is to have like this this back and forth. Let's say it's very specific and explicit, or implicit in the in certain cases, but it's tangible. You can feel it, and this is partly conveyed through a warmth, especially in the case of FETI. In the case of TIFE, what you get is a desire to have an exchange, but it will be more from the perspective of talking about concrete things, content, clarifying something. Often TI dominance or TI auxiliary will want to just get to a firmer footing in terms of understanding something. But there is this desire for an exchange. Now, in the case of FITE, and even more so in the case of TFI, so here I'm talking about INFPs and ENFPs on the one hand, and then INTJs and ENTJs on the other hand. You do not get the same feeling. You get the impression that the person is making a point, expressing something, sometimes very well, sometimes not well, like any of us. Either way, but there's not nearly as much, in my experience, of an underlying reaching out for an exchange in this opened up forum of conversation. There's a holding back that you feel. And one of the things I've learned about FIT users, and I got to the point where I thought to myself, well, I think that I finally understand them a bit better. Especially INTJs. It was to do with INTJs at the time, but then I was able to extrapolate a little bit from that, INFPs as well, and so on. Is that this doesn't mean that I don't want to exchange. It's just that they don't manifest it as naturally. It's not written into the DNA of their mode of expression. But that doesn't mean that they don't want to have this exchange, or that they don't think that their opinion can change. In fact, you'll find oftentimes that FETI users are maybe more forthcoming in saying they're wrong. But this doesn't mean that FIT users are not willing to say they're wrong or willing to acknowledge it. They just, sorry. Sorry about that. They're just not as forthcoming when it comes to saying it. It's almost like they allow it to be implied, or they allow it to not be said, even though it is clear. And you will come across posts that are written in a separate context where it will be clear that the person has reconsidered their options, but they're not as eager to just go and express it to everybody. And so there is this reserve about, on the one hand, making it clear that there's to be an exchange, and on the other hand, making it clear that they want to change their minds, and so on. If you feel this reserve, or if you feel this closeness, it's very likely that the person is an FIT user, or the reverse. But keep in mind that this does not mean that it's to be taken literally. If you get into the mind of an FI user, you'll just realize that the feelings are often similar. They're just manifested differently. But this distinction, you'll notice if you look at the way someone's writing and you sort of use that, fairly informal grid, you might notice that there is quite a big difference, a gap between, on the one hand, FET users and on the other, FIT users. There's a reserve on the one hand and quite a bit less reserve on the other. Alright, see you soon, guys. I'll hopefully start making videos more often from now on, now that I'm settled at last. It's been a long process. Ciao.